In this video, I will show to you how you can build configuration-based generic data pipelines in Microsoft Fabric using configuration files, lookup activity, and for each activity. Stay tuned. Welcome to the video. My name is Aleksi, and on this channel I cover Microsoft Fabric and Azure related topics. In this video, we're continuing our journey with Microsoft Fabric data engineering, and today we're going to cover building generic and configuration-based data pipelines. This video is also part of my Microsoft Fabric data engineering series. A link to the playlist can be found in the description below. And in this video, we're going to use concepts and activities that we have already covered in the previous videos in this series, like lookup and for each activity. With those activities and some dynamic content, we're going to cover the concepts of generic and configurable data pipelines. We have already touched this topic a bit in the previous episodes, but I want to dedicate this video to these configurable and generic data pipelines so that you really understand the concept, since in my opinion this is one of the most essential concepts to understand with data pipelines. But now enough talking, and let's open up Fabric and learn how this concept works in action. Now I have the Fabric open here and I have my Lakehouse open. In this Lakehouse I have created a new folder called Fabric DE Series 21, and in that folder I have three subfolders. I have configuration folder, destination folder, and a source folder. Let's start from the source folder. In the source folder I have 4 txt files. In these files I just have some random content, since the content doesn't really matter, since we are going to just use the binary copy in this demo today. And today I would like to copy these files from our source folder to our destination folder. But for this copy operation we are actually going to build a configurable pipeline, and then we have this configuration folder where we have the configuration for that pipeline that we are going to build. In this first configuration we have the configuration for our first 2 files, for our file 1 and file 2, and we have the instruction here where to find those files and where to copy them. So we have the source folder property here, and that tells where is the folder for our file, and then we have the source file name, which tells the name of our file, and then we have the destination folder, which tells the destination folder where our file is going, and then we have the destination file name that will be the file name in the destination once we have copied the file. And this first configuration handles those 2 first files. Then we have our second configuration, and here basically we have exactly the same properties that we had in that first configuration, but now we have the configuration for the file 3 and file 4 here. And now let's talk a bit about these file names that I have here. I have that 001 and 002 here in the file names. And in the pipeline logic, we're actually going to use parameters that we're going to give our pipeline to determine which configuration we are going to use when the pipeline runs. This means that we could actually have here way more of these configuration files that would copy different files based on the configuration. But let's keep things simple and let's just use these 2 configuration files today. And now let's start to build our pipeline. Let's go and let's create a new data pipeline, and let's name that pipeline according to our naming conventions. And let's wait for our pipeline canvas to load up. And then what we want to first to do is to look up the configuration. So for that we're going to need the lookup activity that we have covered in the previous videos in this series. And to this lookup, let's name this lookup a bit differently, and let's name this lookup configuration. And to the connection we want to configure our Lakehouse that we are going to use. And then we're of course going to use the file section since our configuration is there, and then we are going to point this directory to our configuration. So that will be the Fabric DE Series 21 folder, and under that the configuration folder. Then it will point to this folder that we have here. And next we would create the logic to determine which configuration we are going to use from that folder. And for that we are going to create a pipeline parameter. And let's call this parameter conf ID. And for this conf ID, we don't need to add a default value. And then we can use this conf ID as part of our dynamic expression to determine which files to fetch. And remember, our naming convention for our configuration files is the configuration ID underscore conf.json. So here I'm creating this expression that will concatenate the conf ID to that underscore conf.json string. So this would create the name for our file that we are going to fetch from our configuration folder. So basically, depending on the conf ID parameter, we would use a different file from that folder. And this expression should be okay like this. And next, we want to change the file format to JSON since we're using JSON files, and then we want to untap the first row only option. Since with the first row only option, we would only return the first configuration from our configuration file, but this time we want the entire configuration. So basically those two configurations that we have in the configuration file. And now we could actually try to run this lookup activity and see what happens. Let's run this pipeline to see that we have configured everything correctly. And now we need to input the value for our conf ID. Let's try to fetch our first configuration file. So let's type there 001. And now let's run our pipeline. Now our pipeline has succeeded and we can check out the outputs of our lookup activity. And here we can see that now we have fetched the configuration to our pipeline. And now we can use this configuration in the following step as dynamic logic. And now we would like to pass this value array to our for each activity and iterate over this list of objects that we have here. And then use these properties in these objects in the dynamic content of our copy activity that will be inside our for each activity to do the copying files from our source folder to our destination folder based on these instructions here. So let's do that. So next, let's add for each activity to this pipeline, and then we can name that a little bit better, and let's name this for each configuration item, and then we can select the items that we want to iterate, and basically that will be the lookup configuration value array. So with this output.value, we will be actually getting that value array that we saw there. Basically, this entire set is the output, and when we want to get this value array, we would refer to that output.value, and this will pass down this array to our for each activity. And next, we can add the copy data activity to our for each activity and then start to configure our copy data. And let's configure the source first, and we want to find our lakehouse here, and then we want to use the file section and then to configure the file path. And now we're going to use the dynamic content to configure this copy data activity based on the configuration. So we want to use this source folder to be our file path and the source file name to be our file name. And after that, do the same thing for our destination. And if you remember from the for each video in this series, when we want to refer this entire object here, we would use that add item reference. So if we want to get that source folder, we would use that add item .source folder, and then we would get this value as dynamic content. So let's configure our copy data. So first to the directory, we are going to use the item, and then we are going to add dot, and then we're going to use the .source folder. And then to the file name, we're going to again use the add item and then dot and then the source file name. And other settings should be all right since we are going to copy the files in binary format. And now we should be done with our source configuration. Next, let's configure our destination. Again, let's select the lakehouse that we're going to use. And then let's select the file section and then to the directory. Again, use add item reference and then dot. But now let's use the destination folder and then to the file name, we're going to use add item and then we are going to use the destination file name. And again, we don't need to touch any other settings here. So now we have basically configured this correctly as well. And now we are ready to run our pipeline and see what happens. But before we do that, I would like you to know that I spent a ton of my free time creating these videos for you. And that's why I would like you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more Mixed Fabric data engineering content. It doesn't cost you anything and I would highly appreciate that. But now let's go back to the Fabric. And now we can run our pipeline by clicking this run button here. And then we have to input the value for our conf ID. Let's use the first configuration that we have there. So let's type there 001 and then run our pipeline. And now our pipeline is running, so we need to wait it to succeed. And now our pipeline has succeeded, and we can see that we first run our lookup configuration that returned the configuration from our configuration file, and then we iterated over that configuration and used the values from our configuration as dynamic content in our copy data activities, and copied data from our source folder to our destination folder according to instructions. So with those instructions, we only should have copied those first two files. So we can check out our destination folder. Do we have some files here? Let's refresh that folder, and we have first two files there. Remember, we had 4 files here, but since we only now run with that first configuration, we were only able to copy those first 2 files. But now let's create a new data pipeline, and I'm going to explain to you why quite soon. And to this pipeline, we are going to just add 2 invoke pipeline activities. And let's add another invoke pipeline. And with this, I'm trying to explain to you about the concept of this kind of a generic pipeline. And with these 2 invoke pipeline activities, we could be actually running exactly the same pipeline that we just created. And with the first invoke pipeline activity, we could pass the configuration value of 001, and to the second one, we select exactly the same pipeline, and now we would pass the configuration value of 002. This means that we would actually use the same pipeline as part of another pipeline 2 times, but we would do different operations based on the parameter value, which would then determine which configuration to use for that pipeline. This means that this original pipeline that we created is kind of a generic pipeline that we can instruct based on the configuration, and that configuration is chosen based on the parameter. With this concept, we can use the same pipeline in multiple different pipelines to perform little bit different tasks. Of course, always the task is to move binary data from place A to B. This means that for these similar operations, we can just create this generic pipeline, and then we don't have to create a new pipeline when we have a different use case that is very similar to one that we had previously. Then we would just have to create a new configuration, and we wouldn't have to touch the pipeline itself at all. And now I want to discuss a little bit more about these configuration files and why I'm using these JSON files instead of database tables like some other people do. In my opinion, using configuration files is the way to go, because using this JSON format allows you to do way more things than using database tables, because these support more complex data types like arrays that you can have as part of your configuration. Also, another point is version control. When doing things professionally, you would like to have these configuration files in your version control, and then just use some DevOps pipelines or some release pipelines to deploy these configuration files from one environment to another. And using database tables, using that version control is not so straightforward as using files. So that's why I would rather use files than data in a database table. Also, one key thing to consider is also the naming conventions for your configuration files and what kind of logic you want to have when using those generic pipelines to determine which configuration file to use. But yeah, these are some things that you can figure out on your own in your own environment and come up with a system that works for you. Now you should have an idea how to use these kind of a generic configuration-based pipelines in Microsoft Fabric. If you'd like to learn more about Fabric, check out this video next. Now I thank you for watching and see you in that video.